I actually, though, want to start. So we just had a Memorial Day weekend here, and I spent a lot of time reading about the Green Movement and books on its history and some writings, particularly by the early pioneers, as well as some more recent writers. And one of the things that I kept noticing was the way that they would describe production. Anytime that they were talking about human beings producing, it was always treated as this mindless, short range, essentially destructive activity. And so here's just a few examples pulled basically at random from A Fierce Screen Fire by an environmentalist journalist, Philip Shabekoff. So on page 54, he says, for most of the 19th century, the ebullient young country was still not ready to take a sober look at the environmental consequences of its long binge on expansion and development. On page 55, the government in Washington was, by the 1870s, starting to exhibit some concern over the consequences of unthinking land use and resource exploitation. On page 6, American was a virgin land, a land to be admired, even loved, but to be deflowered forcibly when necessary to satisfy the passions that drove men westward. So the settlers were raping a continent. On page 51 talks about how heedless destruction of nature can have adverse consequences for humans. And on page 69, that environmentalism was the realization that the freewheeling anything goes approach to land and resources that had spurred the building of a new nation was no longer acceptable. On page 60, it tells us that conservation holds that people have not only the right, but the duty to control the use of the natural resources, which are the great sources of prosperity. And it regards the absorption of these resources by special interests, unless their operations are under effective public control, as a moral wrong. So and this is throughout the anytime you're actually describing development or industry, there really is no such thing as production, if that means the intelligent transforming of the earth to create the values that we need to flourish. It's effectively treated almost as overconsumption of, quote, as they put it, nature's bounty. And like, if that really were the model for how the world works, then yeah, I mean, it's unsustainable if you're just consuming things at a pace faster than they can be replenished by nature. And it would lead to ultimate catastrophe. And to the extent people that like buy into this way of thinking, it's very plausible that we need, green elites to rein in our short range, mindless impulses. And part of what was interesting to me about this is that it's wider than environmentalism. So before I came to the Center for Industrial Progress with Alex, I was writing on the more broad attacks on capitalism and business. And this same sort of attitude towards production, that it's just this mindless short range activity, really is widespread on almost every issue. And I think one of the deep roots of it philosophically is what's known as the soul body dichotomy, which is this idea that there's not just one natural universe, but there's two worlds, where you have this higher spiritual world and then the lower material world. And so like Plato would say that, the people at the bottom of society are the people who produce the material goods. And then at the top, you have these philosopher kings concerned with the higher, more real reality of ideas, or the spirit. And today, the one way that this shows up politically is just this idea that capitalism is immoral because it's failing to constrain the short range destructive impulses of materialists. And so we need this mystical elite to control us, only it's not the church. It's just these people who somehow have like higher forms of knowledge and are of higher moral stature because they're not, quote, greedy. And one way that it's useful to think about the truth, I think, is that what capitalism is, it's the system that constrains the power lust of authoritarians and people who want to use physical force more broadly in order to allow for intelligent transformation. And often you get like people use terms like unrestricted capitalism. I think Bill McKibben has a bunch of this kind of terminology in his latest book. And their goal is to evoke fear, like, oh man, unrestrained, unrestricted, that sounds really dangerous. But really, the alternative is unrestricted coercion. And so, what capitalism liberates is not this kind of mindless, short range pursuit of exploitation and overconsumption, but human creativity and production. And that's what we'll often call intelligent transformation. which is not to say that there's not cases of unintelligent transformation, but intelligent transformation is the dominant phenomenon, which is why in the moral case for fossil fuels, we get these hockey stick graphs, not the Michael Mann kind of showing catastrophe, but hockey stick graphs showing that there's basically no human progress for eons. And then with the Industrial Revolution, like every aspect of life, including environmental quality, is getting better. And it's precisely because in general what's going on is that we're thinking about how to produce in a way that's actually beneficial, in a way that is long-term creating values for people. And for environmentalists, though, they deny this idea that we can intelligently transform things as free individuals. And like their only model, the only way that they'll even allow that we can intelligently transform things is if you have authoritarian central planners whose contribution is basically to stop us from producing too much or in a way that's not green. So the thing that I think is, I mean, one takeaway here is just how subtle the bias is, in that it's not that they just make this outright argument. It's just in all of the kind of phrasing that shows up in their work. It shows up in the way the media describes things. And that like it's you just have to have a very sensitive antenna towards those things, I think, in order to capture how much the issue is being framed at this very deep level in a very, I think, wrong way. Stefan, I'm curious, like you've read a lot of this stuff. I'm curious if you have any reactions to that.
I find it remarkable how widespread this general thinking is, and ultimately this Malthusian view of humans gobbling up the resources and destroying themselves by doing so is in every field. Certainly in climatology we've seen that, and in energy we see that, and it's actually pouring into concrete policies, in the sense that, for example, many of the policy goals for the energy field as envisioned by politicians by 2030 or 2050 is live with less, not strive to create more, but live with less, be energy efficient, save some energy, not use like 10 times more energy to create, but consume less, use less, do the same with fewer resources, and so on. So very, very timid goals. And just one example that I always see why this is incorrect, the incorrect view of what resources are and how resources are produced, and which sort of debunks the whole Malthusian anti-productivity view, is look at the oceans versus agricultural land. So with agricultural land, what we have done is we've taken a patch of usually forest and deforested it and totally transformed it into something that produces on a relatively small amount of land enormous amounts of food today. We've really sort of perfected that land for our use. And that created like many times over the resources that the original forest would provide for human life. And so we actually created more resources. We didn't, just sort of destroy this patch of forest. We perfected it, or sort of transformed it into something much better, and something that produces more resources. And now look at the oceans, because the oceans have actual problems. Local overfishing is a big problem that we still need to solve. And why is that? And I think it is because with the oceans, we rely on the actual natural processes, right? So ocean fish is replenishing at its natural rate. And if we increase our consumption, yes, we take out too many fish compared to what regrows naturally. But, compared to the agricultural land, we have not yet learned how to sort of perfect that piece of the planet to serve our needs. So in that sense, you can see what could go wrong theoretically, but what increasingly is possible, because I think the agricultural land is much more reflective of the modern human, because we have learned what works, what doesn't work, and we are perfecting our technology to serve our needs long term, we are thinking strategically, like what are the crops of the future? How can we genetically modify crops to go even beyond what we can do now?
Yeah, I mean,
And so on.
I think that's a really good example, and I mean, I think it's notable that really one of the differences that you're pointing out is the difference of a place where private property rights are relatively protected,
Mhm.
and a place in the oceans where we haven't really figured out how to define them effectively. And if you actually look at the kind of case examples that early environmentalists or conservationists were pointing to in order to establish that, oh, we need the government to restrict production, it was almost always places where private property rights either weren't defined at all, such as on public woods uh, and forestry, and or it was places where they were not properly protected. And and so when you have a personal stake in something over the long term, then you're much more likely to act in a way that is allows you to produce value over the long term versus this kind of depletion. um, the other thing that just occurred to me is the like this. I mean, one way to think about environmentalism is that it's an apocalyptic movement or an apocalyptic ideology, and like these are very common throughout history. So the tendency to see something in apocalyptic terms and then have a framework that kind of is coherent inside its own context, but doesn't make sense if you step back and start questioning it. This isn't unique. I mean, we've had these throughout history. So I just got a book on the history of apocalyptic thinking. So I'll be interested to look at that. But this is a case where it's very plausible unless you step back and actually look at, well, how did people produce and under what arrangements did it work and under what arrangements didn't it, and what have the actual results been, because we have not seen the apocalypses emerge. And of course, the kind of trick with climate is that it's going to emerge at some ambiguous future point.